Some days, grief walks with you like an old companion, quiet but always there. For Martin Grady, those morning hikes through the Oregon woods had become his way of carrying the weight of losing his wife 2 years ago. On this particular morning, something catches his eye beneath the moss and fallen leaves, twisted metal that doesn't belong in nature. It's the wreckage of a World War II transport plane, hidden for 80 years. Inside, he finds a waterproof duffel bag with old letters, and a photograph of a young woman who looks exactly like his late wife. The discovery will unlock a forgotten love story and force Martin to face his own unhealed wounds. But what he finds in those letters will change everything he thought he knew about second chances. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Martin Grady had always been a man of routine, but grief had made him religious about it. Every morning at 6:30, he'd fill the same ceramic mug, the one Eleanor had painted for him during a pottery class 15 years ago, with black coffee, and stand at the kitchen window overlooking the small garden she'd tended with such care. The roses were overgrown now, their blooms wild and untamed without her guiding hand, but he couldn't bring himself to prune them. It felt too much like erasing her. At 62, Martin carried himself with the measured dignity of a man who had spent 35 years teaching high school history. His salt and pepper beard was neatly trimmed, his flannel shirts pressed, and his hiking boots, the expensive ones Eleanor had insisted he buy, were always clean and ready by the door. He was the kind of man neighbors described as reliable and pleasant, though none had seen much of him since the funeral. The house felt too large now, filled with the echoes of a life shared. Eleanor's reading glasses still sat on the nightstand beside a bookmark marking page 247 of a novel she'd never finish. Her coffee cup, the matching partner to his, remained in the dish drainer where he'd placed it after washing it that final morning, unable to put it away in the cabinet where it belonged. These small shrines to her presence had become both comfort and torment. Their home sat on 3 acres at the edge of the Cascade foothills, where Douglas firs stretched toward the sky, and morning mist clung to the valleys like gentle ghosts. Eleanor had fallen in love with the property first, during a weekend drive in their early 30s, when they were still teachers saving every penny for a down payment. She'd made him pull over at the weathered for sale sign and walk the overgrown trails that would later become their daily hiking routes. "Can you imagine it, Martin?" she'd said, her face flushed with excitement as she spun in a clearing that would become their garden. "We could grow old here, really old, with grandchildren running through these trees and stories to tell about every rock and stream. They'd grown old here, all right. Yeah, all. But the grandchildren had never come, and their daughter Sarah had grown distant, pursuing a career in environmental law that kept her busy on the other side of the country. Phone calls had dwindled to holidays and birthdays, conversations stilted and brief, filled with the kind of polite inquiries that revealed how little they knew about each other's daily lives. Martin blamed himself for the distance. He'd been too focused on his students, too invested in bringing history alive for teenagers who'd rather be anywhere else than listening to him explain the significance of the Marshall Plan. Eleanor had been the one who remembered to call Sarah, who sent care packages during college and law school, who tried to bridge the gap that had somehow opened between father and daughter during Sarah's rebellious teenage years. The irony wasn't lost on him that a man who had dedicated his career to preserving the past had somehow failed to maintain his connection to his own family's future. His morning routine had evolved in the 2 years since Eleanor's death. Coffee and quiet contemplation, followed by a solitary breakfast of oatmeal with honey, Eleanor's influence still guiding his choices toward heart-healthy options. Then the hike. Always the hike. It was the only part of his day that felt genuinely necessary, the only time the weight in his chest lifted enough for him to breathe freely. The trail system they'd developed together wound through nearly 5 miles of mixed forest, following deer paths and stream beds marked with small cairns Eleanor had built to guide them home. She'd named different sections: Philosopher's Corner for the moss-covered log, where they'd sit to debate everything from local politics to the meaning of life; Cathedral Grove for the circle of ancient firs that filtered sunlight into something that felt sacred; and Sunset Point, though the view was actually east-facing and perfect for watching dawn break over the distant peaks. Martin still followed their established route religiously, though he no longer stopped to examine the wildflowers Eleanor had loved or to collect the interesting rocks she'd insisted on bringing home. He walked now with purpose, but not joy, covering ground with the steady pace of a man fulfilling an obligation rather than pursuing pleasure. The other hikers he occasionally encountered, mostly weekend visitors from Portland who drove out to experience what the guidebooks called pristine wilderness, would nod politely as they passed. Some attempted conversation, commenting on the weather or asking about trail conditions, but Martin had become skilled at the kind of brief, friendly responses that discouraged further interaction. He wasn't unfriendly exactly, but he'd lost the knack for small talk, for the easy social connections that had once come naturally when Eleanor was beside him to carry the conversational load. Mrs. Chen, his nearest neighbor 1/2 mile down the gravel road, still brought him casseroles every few weeks, always with gentle inquiries about his health and pointed suggestions that he might enjoy the book club at the library or the hiking group that met Saturday mornings at the ranger station. He appreciated her kindness, but found reasons to decline her invitations. The truth was simpler and more complicated than loneliness. He wasn't ready to let go of his grief enough to make room for new relationships. His wedding ring still encircled his finger, the gold band worn thin after 35 years of marriage. Eleanor's matching ring sat in the jewelry box on her dresser, along with the simple diamond engagement ring he'd saved 3 months' salary to buy when they were both young teachers sharing a tiny apartment and big dreams. Sometimes he'd hold her rings, feeling their weight, and remembering the day he'd slipped the engagement ring onto her finger during a picnic in the very woods where he now walked alone. The phone rang most evenings. Telemarketers mostly, though. Occasionally, his brother called from Arizona to check in with the kind of careful concern that revealed how worried the family had become about his isolation. These conversations followed a predictable pattern: assurances that he was eating well and staying busy, updates on his brother's retirement activities, and gentle suggestions that he might consider visiting, maybe even relocating somewhere with more social opportunities. Sarah called every few weeks, their conversations carrying the weight of accumulated misunderstandings and missed opportunities for connection. She'd inherited her mother's environmental passion, but her father's stubborn streak, building a successful career advocating for wilderness protection while maintaining what felt like a protective wilderness around her personal life. Martin knew the basics. She lived in Seattle, worked for a non-profit, had been dating someone named David for 2 years. But the details of her daily existence remained as foreign to him as if she lived on another continent. The guilt was a constant companion. During Eleanor's final illness, when the cancer had progressed beyond treatment and they'd focused on making her comfortable at home, she'd spent precious energy trying to orchestrate reconciliation between her husband and daughter. Her final, coherent conversation with Martin had been about family, about the importance of not letting pride prevent love, about how much she worried about leaving them alone with their stubborn inability to communicate. "Promise me," she'd whispered, her voice barely audible, but her grip on his hand surprisingly strong. "Promise me you'll try with Sarah. She needs you more than she lets on, and you need her more than you want to admit." He'd promised, of course. But in the months that followed, overwhelmed by the logistics of death and the crushing reality of daily life without his partner, he'd found reasons to delay those difficult conversations. Sarah had attended the funeral, stayed for a week to help with arrangements, and then returned to her life in Seattle. Their interactions since had been cordial but cautious, both of them seemingly afraid that deeper emotional honesty might reveal how little they knew about connecting across the gulf of years and accumulated resentments. The house grew darker earlier, now that autumn was settling into the Oregon hills. Martin had taken to reading in Eleanor's chair, a wingback recliner, positioned to catch the afternoon light from the western windows. Because sitting in his own chair felt like admitting she was never coming back to hers. He read history books, mostly biographies of figures from World War II, the era that had always fascinated him most as a teacher. Something about that generation's combination of sacrifice and resilience spoke to him, their ability to endure unthinkable hardship while maintaining faith in something larger than their individual struggles. Tonight, as he prepared for bed in the house that felt too quiet and too large, Martin had no way of knowing that tomorrow's routine hike would shatter the careful structure he'd built around his grief. He had no way of anticipating that a discovery made in the deep woods would force him to confront not only his own inability to move forward, but also a love story that had waited 80 years to reach its conclusion. He placed Eleanor's coffee mug in the sink beside his own, as he had every night for 2 years, and climbed the stairs to the bedroom where her pillow still held the faint scent of her lavender shampoo. Outside, the Oregon wind moved through the Douglas firs with a sound like distant conversation, and somewhere in the darkness, twisted metal and forgotten dreams waited beneath a blanket of moss and time for their appointment with destiny. The morning started like every other for the past 2 years. Martin filled Eleanor's painted mug with coffee, stood at the kitchen window watching mist rise from the garden, and laced up his hiking boots with the methodical precision of a man whose routines had become sacred rituals. The October air carried the sharp scent of wood smoke and decomposing leaves, autumn settling into the Oregon hills with its familiar promise of rain and renewal. He took the usual route toward Cathedral Grove, following the narrow trail that wound between towering Douglas firs and moss-covered boulders. The morning light filtered through the canopy in golden shafts, illuminating spider webs heavy with dew and the occasional flash of a squirrel's tail disappearing up bark-covered trunks. This was the hour when the forest felt most alive, when the night creatures were settling into sleep and the day shift was beginning their ancient routines. Martin had walked this path so many times he could navigate it with his eyes closed, his feet automatically avoiding the route that jutted across. The trail at mile marker 2 and the loose stone that had tripped Eleanor during their last hike together. But today, something felt different. A sound that didn't belong, not quite metallic, not quite natural, drifted through the trees from somewhere off the established trail. He paused, tilting his head to listen. The forest held its breath around him, and then he heard it again. A faint creaking, like old metal settling under pressure. His teacher's mind immediately began cataloging possibilities. Posted signs warned hikers about old logging equipment abandoned in the woods, rusted cables, and forgotten machinery that could pose dangers to the unwary. But this sound came from deeper in the forest, well beyond where any logging operation would have reached. Curiosity won over caution. Martin pushed through a curtain of young firs, their branches wet with morning condensation that soaked through his flannel shirt within minutes. The terrain grew rougher as he climbed a steep slope, covered with fallen logs and granite outcroppings. His breathing came harder. 2 years of solitary hiking had maintained his fitness, but Eleanor had always been the one to suggest the more adventurous detours from their established routes. The metallic creaking grew louder as he climbed, accompanied now by the sound of something moving in the wind. At the crest of a small ridge, Martin stopped short, his breath catching in his throat at what lay below him in a natural depression between 2 massive boulders. The wreckage was almost completely camouflaged by 8 decades of forest growth. Moss covered every surface in a thick green carpet, and young trees had sprouted through gaps in what had once been a fuselage. But the basic shape was unmistakable, the broken skeleton of an aircraft, its wings twisted and separated from the main body, scattered across an area roughly the size of a tennis court. Martin descended carefully, his historian's mind racing. The size and configuration suggested a military transport plane, probably from World War II, based on the visible design elements beneath the vegetation. How had this remained undiscovered for so long? The crash site was less than 3 miles. From his house in woods he and Eleanor had explored for decades, yet it had remained invisible beneath nature's patient reclamation project. The sound that had drawn him here came from a piece of torn metal that moved in the morning breeze, scraping against a tree branch with the rhythm of a broken bell. Martin approached the main section of fuselage, noting how the impact had compressed and twisted the aircraft into an almost unrecognizable mass of aluminum and steel. Yet somehow, impossibly, one section near what had been the cargo area remained relatively intact, protected by the canopy of a massive cedar that must have grown around it over the intervening decades. Inside this protected space, Martin could see something that made his pulse quicken. A dark shape that looked deliberately placed rather than scattered by impact. A military duffel bag, its canvas sides stained dark with decades of moisture, but apparently intact. The bag sat wedged between 2 structural beams, as if someone had secured it there intentionally. Martin spent 20 minutes finding a safe way into the wreckage, testing each piece of metal before trusting it with his weight. The years had made the aluminum brittle in some places, while fusing it solid in others. Finally, he managed to reach the duffel bag, his hands trembling slightly as he worked it free from its resting place. The bag was heavier than expected, and Martin could feel distinct shapes inside: books, papers, and something that felt like picture frames. A metal name tag hung from the handle, the letters barely visible beneath corrosion. L.T.J. Morrison, U.S. Army Air Forces. Martin carried the bag back to solid ground before opening it, his heart pounding with the excitement of discovery and the weight of responsibility. This wasn't just historical debris. This was someone's life, preserved by accident and discovered by chance 80 years after it had vanished from the world. The bag's contents were wrapped in what had once been a military rain poncho, the rubber. Material cracked, but still functional enough to have protected everything inside from complete destruction. Martin peeled back the layers carefully, feeling like an archaeologist uncovering a tomb. The first item was a leather flight jacket, size medium, with Lieutenant Morrison's name embroidered above the left breast pocket. The leather was stiff and stained, but remarkably preserved. In the jacket's inside pocket, Martin found a wallet containing a driver's license, military identification, and $43 in bills that crumbled at his touch. Beneath the jacket lay a bundle of letters tied with what had once been a blue ribbon, now faded to grey. The envelopes were addressed in a woman's handwriting to Lieutenant James Morrison at various military bases, the return address consistently showing C. Wheeler on Cherry Street in nearby Millbrook, Oregon, a town that had been absorbed into the greater Portland metropolitan area decades ago. But it was the photograph that stopped Martin's breath entirely. The black and white image, preserved between 2 pieces of glass in a simple silver frame, showed a young woman in her early 20s, standing beside a 1940s automobile. She wore a white dress with a floral pattern, her dark hair victory-rolled in the style of the era, her smile brilliant and unguarded as she looked directly into the camera. The resemblance to Eleanor was so striking that Martin's hands began to shake. It wasn't just a general similarity. The shape of her eyes, the curve of her smile, even the way she tilted her head slightly to the left when posed for photographs. Martin had seen Eleanor make that exact expression thousands of times over their 35 years together. The woman in the photograph could have been Eleanor's twin, born 60 years too early. Martin sank onto a fallen log, the photograph trembling in his hands as memories flooded through him. Eleanor in their wedding photos, making that same bright smile. Eleanor on their honeymoon, posing beside rental cars in national parks across the West. Eleanor just last year, still beautiful at 60, despite the cancer that was already stealing. Her strength, tilting her head in that familiar way as she smiled for what would be their final anniversary photo. The letters revealed a love story that felt achingly familiar. Catherine Wheeler, my dearest cat, as Jimmy Morrison called her in letter after letter, had worked at the Millbrook lumber mill during the war, while her pilot sweetheart flew supply missions up and down the Pacific coast. Their correspondence painted a picture of young love tested by distance and uncertainty, sustained by dreams of a future together when the war ended. "I've been thinking about that little house we looked at on Cherry Street," Jimmy had written in one letter dated March 1943. "The one with the big kitchen where you said you'd teach me to make your grandmother's apple pie. I dream about coming home to that kitchen, cat. I dream about growing old with you in that house." Martin read letter after letter as the morning mist burned off, and the forest around him came fully alive with bird song and rustling leaves. Catherine's responses, preserved in carbon copies she had apparently given to Jimmy, revealed a woman of intelligence and determination, working to support the war effort while planning for a peacetime future with the man she loved. But somewhere in these woods, Lieutenant James Morrison's plane had gone down during what should have been a routine supply run in October 1943. The letters suggested he had been returning from a mission to deliver medical supplies to isolated coastal communities, flying alone in weather that was marginal but not impossible. Martin carefully rewrapped the letters and photograph, his mind reeling with questions and connections he couldn't yet fully process. This discovery was more than historical accident. It felt like destiny, like the universe had waited 80 years to bring these artifacts to someone who would understand their significance. As he climbed back toward the established trail, the duffel bag secure in his arms, Martin felt something shifting inside him. For 2 years he had walked these woods carrying his grief like a familiar burden. Now he carried something else, a mystery that demanded answers, a love story that deserved completion, and a purpose that might finally give meaning to his careful routines of remembrance and solitude. Martin spent the rest of that day poring over the contents of Lieutenant Morrison's duffel bag, spreading everything carefully across his dining room table like evidence in a criminal investigation. His 35 years of teaching history had trained him to approach artifacts methodically, but this felt different, more personal, more urgent than any classroom exercise in historical analysis. The letters painted a vivid picture of wartime Oregon, when lumber mills worked around the clock to supply wood for military construction, and young women took jobs that had traditionally belonged to men. Catherine Wheeler emerged from her correspondence as a woman of remarkable strength and independence, managing not only her factory work, but also caring for her aging parents, while maintaining an unwavering faith in her future with Jimmy Morrison. By the time the afternoon light began to fade, Martin had arranged the letters in chronological order and compiled a basic timeline of the relationship. Jimmy and Catherine had met at a USO dance in Portland in January 1942, begun corresponding when he was transferred to a base in California, and maintained their romance through increasingly passionate letters that spoke of marriage plans and shared dreams of post-war life. The last letter in the collection was dated October 12, 1943, just 3 days before Jimmy's final supply run. In it, he had written about his excitement over an upcoming 2-week leave that would allow him to spend time with Catherine and finally have that serious conversation we've been putting off. The implication was clear. Jimmy Morrison had been planning to propose. Martin's hands shook slightly as he held that final letter, thinking about all the proposals that had never happened, all the lives that had been cut short by war and circumstance. His own proposal to Eleanor had taken place on a hiking trail not 5 miles from where Jimmy's plane had crashed, a coincidence that felt too significant to ignore. Sleep came fitfully that night, Martin's dreams filled with images of young Lovers separated by war and the haunting resemblance between Catherine Wheeler and his late wife. He woke before dawn, with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since Eleanor's death, driven by questions that demanded answers and a growing conviction that he had been chosen to complete this 80-year-old story. After his morning coffee, Martin drove the 23 miles to Millbrook, or what had once been Millbrook, before urban sprawl had transformed it into another Portland suburb. The original downtown had been preserved as a historical district, complete with interpretive signs describing the community's role in wartime lumber production. But the streets where Catherine Wheeler had lived and worked were now lined with coffee shops, boutiques, and condominiums that bore no resemblance to the working-class neighborhood depicted in her letters. The Millbrook Public Library occupied a modern building that had replaced the original Carnegie Library, but its local history section contained treasures that made Martin's historian heart sing. Mrs. Henderson, the reference librarian, was a woman in her 70s who had grown up in Millbrook and remembered stories her parents had told about the war years, Morrison. She repeated thoughtfully when Martin explained his search. That name is familiar. There was some kind of tragedy, I think, a pilot who went missing during the war. My mother used to talk about a young woman who worked at the mill, Catherine something, who waited for years for her boyfriend to come home. Mrs. Henderson led Martin to a series of filing cabinets containing local newspaper archives that had been preserved on microfilm. The Millbrook Gazette from October 1943 contained a brief article about Lieutenant Morrison's disappearance. Local pilot missing in Coast Range. The story was buried on page 3, just a few paragraphs noting that an Army Air Forces transport plane had failed to arrive at its destination and that search efforts were being hampered by bad weather. More interesting were the social pages from the months that followed. Catherine Wheeler's name appeared regularly in coverage of war bond drives, Red Cross activities, and lumber mill social events. The descriptions painted a picture of a young woman throwing herself into community service while maintaining hope for her missing sweetheart's return. She was quite the local beauty, Mrs. Henderson observed, reading over Martin's shoulder. My mother always said Catherine Wheeler could have had her pick of any man in town, but she stayed loyal to that pilot. For years. Tragic, really. Martin spent 3 hours working through the newspaper archives, creating a timeline of Catherine's life after Jimmy's disappearance. The war ended, veterans returned home, and gradually Catherine's name appeared less frequently in the social pages. By 1947, there were no mentions of her at all. The city directory might help, Mrs. Henderson suggested, producing a series of thick volumes that tracked residents' addresses and occupations year by year. If she stayed in Millbrook, we should be able to follow her movements. The directories revealed that Catherine Wheeler had lived at 412 Cherry Street through 1946, working at Millbrook Lumber Company until the mill's closure in late 1945. After that, her trail went cold for 2 years before reappearing in 1948 as Catherine Miller at a different address on Oak Street. Miller, Martin repeated, feeling a mixture of sadness and understanding. She married someone else. Mrs. Henderson nodded sympathetically. Can't blame her, really. 4 years is a long time to wait for someone who might never come home. And women didn't have as many options then. Economic security often trumped romantic ideals. The marriage records confirmed what the directory had suggested. Catherine Wheeler had married Robert Miller, a local bank manager, in a small ceremony in June 1948. The newspaper's brief wedding announcement noted that the bride had been employed in wartime defense work and that the couple planned to honeymoon in California before settling in Millbrook. Martin found himself staring at the microfilm screen, imagining Catherine in her wedding dress, smiling for photographers while carrying the secret knowledge that her true love lay dead in the forests just 20 miles away. Had she ever stopped hoping? Had she married Robert Miller for love, or simply because she couldn't wait forever for a ghost? Is there any chance Catherine Miller or her family might still be in the area? Martin asked. Mrs. Henderson pursed, her lips thoughtfully. The Millers moved away in the 1960s, I believe. Robert took a job with a Portland bank. But I seem to remember they had children. Maybe someone would know what became of them. She disappeared into the library's administrative offices and returned with a phone book from 1965. The last year, the Millers appeared in local records. No children listed with them, but there might be other family members. The Wheeler family had deep roots in Millbrook. Catherine's parents owned a small farm outside town. Martin spent another hour researching the Wheeler family, discovering that Catherine's parents had died in the early 1950s and that the family farm had been sold to developers. But a marriage announcement from 1952 revealed that Catherine had a younger sister, Margaret Wheeler, who had married a man named Thomas Bennett and moved to Seattle. As Martin drove home that afternoon, his car filled with photocopies of newspaper, articles and handwritten notes, he felt the familiar excitement of a historical puzzle beginning to take shape. But this was more than academic research. This was a personal mission to complete a love story that had been interrupted by tragedy and hidden by time. The artifacts spread across his dining room table seemed to pulse with renewed significance. As the afternoon light shifted through Eleanor's garden, somewhere in Seattle, Margaret Wheeler Bennett might still be alive. Somewhere in these documents lay the key to understanding what had happened to Catherine after she'd given up hope of Jimmy Morrison's return. Martin picked up Jimmy's final letter, the one that spoke of serious conversations and future plans, and felt a familiar ache in his chest. Eleanor had been gone 2 years, but he was still waiting, still unable to move forward, still hoping for something that would never return. Perhaps, he thought, helping Jimmy and Catherine find peace might teach him something about letting go. The phone book search for Bennett families in Seattle took Martin 3 days of methodical calling, working through listings during the quiet evening hours when his loneliness felt most acute. Most calls led to dead ends or disconnected numbers, but on Thursday evening, an elderly man named William Bennett confirmed that his late father Thomas had indeed married a Margaret Wheeler from Oregon. "My Aunt Catherine," William said, his voice crackling through the long-distance connection. "I remember her visiting when I was a boy. She died maybe 10 years ago. Breast cancer, I think. But her daughter Rebecca might be able to help you. She lives up in Seattle, works for some environmental group." Martin's hands trembled as he wrote down Rebecca's contact information. After 3 days of frustrated searching, he was finally connecting with Catherine's family. More importantly, he was about to speak with someone who had known the woman in Jimmy Morrison's photograph, who could fill in the decades of mystery between her wartime romance and her death. Rebecca Wheeler Thompson answered her phone with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to handling calls from strangers seeking environmental advocacy. But her voice softened immediately when Martin explained his discovery and his connection to the crashed plane in the Oregon woods. "My grandmother's first love," Rebecca said, wonder creeping into her tone. "She talked about him sometimes, especially near the end. Jimmy Morrison. She never forgot him, you know. Even after she married my grandfather, Robert, even after they had my mother, she kept Jimmy's memory alive in quiet ways." They arranged to meet the following Saturday at Catherine's childhood home, which Rebecca had inherited and was in the process of cleaning out before selling. The house on Cherry Street had been converted into apartments decades earlier, but Rebecca still had keys to the attic space where Catherine's personal belongings had been stored for years. Martin spent Friday night lying awake, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the woman whose photograph had so perfectly captured Eleanor's smile. He found himself wondering if Catherine had ever walked these same Oregon trails, if she had stood in clearings similar to the one where his own love story had begun, making promises to a young man in uniform who would never return to keep them. Saturday. Morning arrived grey and drizzly, typical October weather that made the drive to Millbrook feel like a journey through watercolor paintings. Rebecca Wheeler-Thompson was waiting in the driveway of a modest craftsman-style house that showed its age in sagging gutters and peeling paint. She was a woman in her 50s, with her grandmother's dark eyes and the same slight tilt to her head that Martin had noticed in Catherine's photograph. "Mr. Grady," she said, extending a firm handshake, "I have to tell you, this feels like something out of a movie. Finding my grandmother's lost love after all these years." Rebecca led him to an attic space that felt like a museum of mid-20th century life. Boxes labeled in careful handwriting contained everything from Christmas decorations to photo albums, from wedding china to handmade quilts. But it was the wooden hope chest in the corner that held the most significant treasures. "Grandmother kept this locked for as long as I can remember," Rebecca explained, producing a small brass key. "My mother found it after the funeral, but we never felt right about going through it. Maybe we were waiting for someone like you to come along." The hope chest contained layers of carefully preserved fabric, a wedding dress that had never been worn. The ivory silk was yellowed with age but still beautiful, hand-sewn with pearl buttons and delicate lacework that spoke of months of patient preparation. Beneath the dress lay additional treasures, a small collection of china pieces meant for a first home, embroidered linens that would have graced a marriage bed, and a leather-bound diary with Catherine Wheeler embossed in gold letters on the cover. Martin's hands shook as he opened the diary, afraid of invading such private thoughts, but driven by the need to understand this woman whose face had haunted his dreams for a week. The entries began in January 1942, the same month Catherine had met Jimmy Morrison, and chronicled their courtship with the breathless excitement of young love. "He makes me laugh," Catherine had written after their third date. "Not just polite laughter, but the kind that comes from deep in your belly and makes your cheeks hurt. When he looks at me, I feel like the only woman in the world. Is it possible to fall in love so quickly? Mother says I'm being foolish, but my heart knows what it knows." The entries continued through their separation when Jimmy was transferred to California, documenting Catherine's work at the lumber mill and her efforts to support the war effort while maintaining their long-distance romance. Her writing revealed a young woman of remarkable maturity and determination, someone who approached love with the same practical intelligence she brought to her wartime responsibilities. But it was the entries after Jimmy's disappearance that broke Martin's heart. Catherine had continued writing to him for months after his plane went missing, documenting her growing desperation and the community's gradual acceptance that Lieutenant Morrison was never coming home. October 15th, 1944. 1 year, she had written in handwriting that was noticeably less steady than earlier entries. "The army has declared Jimmy legally dead, but I refuse to believe it. Death feels different from absence. If Jimmy were truly gone, wouldn't I feel it in my bones? Wouldn't something inside me break irreparably? Instead, I feel him somewhere, just beyond reach, calling to me across a distance I cannot measure." Rebecca watched Martin read with the patient sympathy of someone who had witnessed her grandmother's lifelong sadness. "She waited 4 years," Rebecca explained quietly. 4 years of turning down suitors, of keeping Jimmy's photograph on her nightstand, of believing he would somehow find his way home. My grandfather, Robert, was incredibly patient with her grief. He knew he was marrying a woman who had loved someone else first and completely. The diary entries from Catherine's marriage years revealed a woman who had found contentment, if not passion, who had built a good life with a kind man while never forgetting her first love. She had written about Robert's proposal with gratitude rather than excitement, acknowledging his goodness while admitting that her heart remained partially elsewhere. "Robert understands that part of me will always belong to Jimmy," she had written. "The night before her wedding, he says he can love me enough for both of us, that having most of my heart is better than having all of someone else's. I pray he's right. I pray I can be the wife he deserves while honoring the memory of the man I cannot forget." Martin found himself thinking of his own marriage as he read Catherine's words. Eleanor had been his first and only love, but what if circumstances had been different? What if war or accident had stolen her from him when they were young, and he had been forced to choose between lifelong solitude and a marriage built on friendship rather than passion? She never stopped hoping, Rebecca continued, producing a small wooden box from the bottom of the hope chest. Even after my mother was born, even after decades of marriage to my grandfather, she kept this. The box contained Jimmy Morrison's letters, not copies, but the originals he had sent to Catherine during their wartime separation. She had preserved them carefully, wrapped in tissue paper and tied with the same blue ribbon Martin had found in the crashed plane. Alongside the letters was a small notebook filled with what appeared to be research notes, documenting Catherine's own efforts to discover what had happened to Jimmy's plane. Martin stared at the notebook, realizing that Catherine had spent years conducting the same investigation he had begun just a week ago. She had contacted military records offices, written to veterans organizations, and even hired a private investigator in the 1950s to search the forests where Jimmy's plane had been reported missing. She never found anything, Rebecca said sadly. But she never stopped looking. Even near the end, when the cancer was taking her strength, she would talk about Jimmy and wonder if his family ever knew what happened to him. She felt guilty, somehow, that she had moved on with her life, while he remained lost in those woods. Martin returned home from his meeting with Rebecca carrying more than just historical documents. He carried the weight of Catherine's lifelong search and the responsibility of completing what she had never been able to finish. The military service records Rebecca had shared painted a picture of Lieutenant James Morrison as more than just another wartime casualty. He had been a decorated pilot who volunteered for the most dangerous missions, flying supplies to isolated coastal communities when weather conditions grounded other aircraft. The irony wasn't lost on Martin that Jimmy Morrison had died while trying to help others, carrying medical supplies to a remote lighthouse station where the keeper's wife was seriously ill. The mission should have been routine, a 4-hour round trip along the Oregon coast, but October weather in 1943 had been particularly brutal, with storms moving in from the Pacific faster than meteorologists could track them. Martin spread Jimmy's military records across his dining room table, creating a timeline that would have impressed his former students. The young pilot had enlisted immediately after Pearl Harbor, trained in Texas and California, and distinguished himself in combat missions over the Pacific before being reassigned to domestic supply runs. His commanding officers had noted his exceptional flying skills and his willingness to attempt missions other pilots considered too risky. Morrison volunteers for every dangerous assignment, one evaluation read. His motivation appears to be a desire to end the war as quickly as possible and return to civilian life. He has mentioned plans to marry a young woman in Oregon and start a family. The words hit Martin like a physical blow. Jimmy Morrison had been rushing toward his future with Catherine, taking risks because he believed each dangerous mission brought him closer to the life they had planned together. Instead, his urgency had led him to a lonely death in the Oregon woods, just 20 miles from the woman who would spend the rest of her life wondering what had happened to him. The classified mission reports that Rebecca had somehow obtained, through a Freedom of Information request, revealed details that previous searches had missed. Jimmy's final flight had carried more than medical supplies. He had been transporting classified communications equipment to coastal defense installations, traveling alone because of the sensitive nature of his cargo. More significantly, the crash investigation files indicated that Jimmy's plane had been found partially intact, with evidence suggesting he had survived the initial impact. Search teams had discovered that someone had moved supplies from the wreckage and created a makeshift shelter nearby. But a blizzard had moved in during the second day of the search, forcing rescue teams to abandon their efforts until spring. When searchers returned in April 1944, they found no trace of Jimmy Morrison or his makeshift camp. The official conclusion was that he had died of exposure during the winter months, but his body was never recovered. The wreckage had been left where it fell, too damaged to salvage and too remote to justify the expense of removal. Martin read these reports with growing excitement and sorrow. Jimmy had survived the crash, had lived for days or perhaps weeks in the forest, had probably died within hiking distance of civilization. If the weather had been different, if the search had been more thorough, if rescue teams had been better equipped for winter operations, any number of small changes might have brought Jimmy home to Catherine. But what captured Martin's attention most was a detail buried in the investigation notes. Personal effects recovered from the crash site had included a wooden box containing letters and personal documents, which had been forwarded to Morrison's next of kin in Iowa. But the investigating officer had noted that additional personal items may remain at the crash site, as the victim appears to have secured some belongings in a waterproof container before abandoning the aircraft. Martin realized he had found that waterproof container, the duffel bag that had preserved Jimmy's letters and Catherine's photograph for 80 years. But more importantly, he now knew Jimmy's story had never been fully told. The young pilot had survived long enough to secure his most precious possessions, had lived with hope until cold and hunger finally claimed him. That evening, Martin called Rebecca with his discoveries. Her voice caught with emotion as he described Jimmy's survival after the crash and his apparent attempts to preserve Catherine's letters. She always believed he had lived longer than the official report suggested, Rebecca said through tears. Grandmother used to say she could feel his presence in the woods sometimes, as if he was still trying to find his way home to her. People thought she was being romantic, but maybe she was right. They discussed Martin's growing conviction that Jimmy's remains might still be discoverable somewhere near the crash site. If he had survived for days or weeks, there would be evidence, bones, personal effects, perhaps even a grave marker if he had realized death was approaching. What would you do if you found him? Rebecca asked. Martin had been asking himself the same question. Give him the burial he deserves. Make sure Catherine's story is told alongside his. Maybe find his family in Iowa and let them know what really happened. His family, Rebecca repeated thoughtfully. Grandmother tried to contact them in the 1950s, but the letters came back undelivered. The Morrisons had apparently moved away from the farm where Jimmy grew up. Martin felt the familiar thrill of a research challenge presenting itself. Finding Jimmy Morrison's surviving relatives would be more difficult than locating Catherine's family, but not impossible. Military records would provide a starting point, and genealogy websites had made such searches far easier than they would have been during Catherine's attempts decades earlier. But as Martin prepared for bed that night, his enthusiasm was tempered by a growing awareness of his own motivations. Was he really trying to complete Jimmy and Catherine's love story, or was he using their tragedy to avoid confronting his own? The parallels between their situation and his were becoming impossible to ignore. Both involved men who had vanished from women's lives, leaving behind unanswered questions and unfinished business. Eleanor had died in a hospital bed with Martin holding her hand, their last conversation a whispered exchange of love and gratitude. But in some ways, her death had been as sudden and inexplicable as Jimmy's disappearance. One day she had been complaining about fatigue and a persistent cough, and 6 months later, she was gone, leaving Martin as lost and bewildered as Catherine must have felt in 1943. The difference was that Catherine had eventually found the courage to build a new life, to accept love from Robert Miller, even if it wasn't the consuming passion she had shared with Jimmy. Martin had spent 2 years in suspended animation, maintaining Eleanor's coffee cup and garden as if she might return at any moment to reclaim them. As he lay in the darkness, listening to October rain against the windows, Martin wondered if solving Jimmy and Catherine's mystery might teach him something about letting go, about honoring the dead while choosing to remain among the living. Perhaps that was why the universe had led him to that crash site. Not just to complete their story, but to learn how to continue writing his own. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning when Martin was searching genealogy websites for Morrison. Family records. He had been methodical in his approach, starting with Jimmy's military files and working backward through census records and birth certificates. The Morrison family had indeed left Iowa after the war, but Martin's persistence finally uncovered their trail leading to California, where Jimmy's younger brother William had settled after his own military service. William Morrison had died in 1987, but his obituary listed 3 surviving children, including a daughter named Patricia Morrison Hayes, who lived in Sacramento. Martin's hands trembled as he dialed her number, unsure how to explain his discovery to someone who had probably grown up hearing stories about her uncle's wartime disappearance. Patricia's reaction surprised him with its immediate emotional intensity. "Uncle Jimmy," she breathed into the phone. "We never knew what happened to him. Dad searched for years, wrote letters to the army, even hired private investigators in the 1960s. Finding his plane and his letters, it's like answering a prayer we'd given up hope for." They arranged to meet the following weekend, and Patricia promised to bring family photographs and documents that might help complete the picture of Jimmy Morrison's life. But it was during their phone conversation that she mentioned something that stopped Martin's breath entirely. "Uncle Jimmy kept a diary," Patricia said. "Dad found it in his belongings when they shipped his things home after he was declared dead. It was mostly about flying and the war, but the last entries were all about a girl named Catherine. He was planning to propose to her when he got his next leave." Martin felt the familiar ache in his chest as he realized Jimmy Morrison had been just days away from returning to Catherine when his plane crashed. The timing was cruelly precise. Jimmy's final mission had been scheduled to complete his tour of duty, after which he would have had 30 days of leave before reassignment. 30 days that would have included a wedding proposal, a lifetime of plans, and a happiness that had died in the Oregon woods, just 20 miles from its intended destination. But Patricia's next words made Martin's heart race with possibility. The diary mentioned something about a surprise he was planning for Catherine. He'd hidden something special near her house, something he wanted to give her when he proposed. Dad always wondered what it was, but we never found any clues about where he might have hidden it. Martin immediately thought of Jimmy's final letter, the one that mentioned serious conversations and future plans. Had the young pilot been referring to more than just a proposal? Had he already purchased an engagement ring, already chosen a hiding place where it would wait for his return? The possibility consumed Martin's thoughts for the rest of the week. He found himself studying maps of 1940s Millbrook, trying to identify locations where a young pilot might have hidden a proposal surprise. The logical choice would have been somewhere meaningful to both Jimmy and Catherine, somewhere private enough for a romantic revelation, but accessible enough for easy retrieval. When Saturday arrived, Martin drove to Sacramento with a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation. Patricia Morrison Hayes met him at a coffee shop near her home, carrying a leather satchel that contained the Morrison family's preserved memories of their lost son and brother. Jimmy's diary was a small, leather-bound book that had been well used during his military service. The early entries described training, flights, and military life with the matter-of-fact tone of a young man far from home. But the entries from 1943 revealed a different Jimmy Morrison, a man deeply in love and desperately homesick for a life he had barely begun to build. March 15th, 1943. Had my first real leave in 6 months and spent every possible moment with Kat. We walked for hours through those Oregon woods she loves so much, and I tried to memorize every expression on her face, every laugh, every way the sunlight caught her hair. I bought the ring yesterday, used every cent of my savings, plus money I borrowed from Bill. It's not much, but Kat isn't the kind of girl who needs diamonds to feel loved. Martin read entry after entry, describing Jimmy's growing certainty that Catherine Wheeler was the woman he wanted to spend his life with. The young pilot had been remarkably articulate about his feelings, writing with the intensity of someone who understood that war made every emotion more precious and every moment more urgent. But it was the final entry, dated October 12, 1943, that made Martin's pulse quicken with discovery. Leave confirmed for November 1st. 30 glorious days with Cat before they ship me to the Pacific. I've hidden the ring in our special place, the old oak tree near the creek behind her house, where we had our first real kiss. Carved our initials in the bark last time I was home, and hollowed out a space just below them. Cat walks past that tree every day, on her way to work. I love knowing the ring is there waiting, just like I'm waiting to see her face when I ask her to marry me. Martin stared at the diary entry, feeling the weight of destiny settling around him like a familiar coat. Jimmy Morrison had hidden an engagement ring 80 years ago, and Catherine Wheeler had walked past it every day for years without knowing it was there. After her marriage to Robert Miller, after decades of wondering what might have been, after her death in the 1990s, the ring was probably still waiting in that old oak tree. Patricia watched Martin's face as he processed the implications. "You think you can find it," she said quietly. "You think the ring is still there." "I think Jimmy Morrison deserves to have his proposal delivered," Martin replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Even if it's 80 years late." They spent the afternoon going through Jimmy's other belongings, photographs of him in uniform, letters from family members, and a small wooden box containing his military decorations. Patricia insisted that Martin take copies of everything, along with the original diary. "Uncle Jimmy would want his story told," she said, as they prepared to part ways. "And if you find that ring, if you can somehow complete what he started, well, that would mean more to our family than any memorial or monument ever could." During the drive home, Martin found himself thinking about the oak tree that had sheltered young love and hidden promises. 80 years of weather and growth would have changed the landscape dramatically, but old oak trees were stubborn survivors. If Jimmy's hiding place had been well chosen, if the elements had been kind, the ring might still be exactly where a lovesick pilot had placed it in 1943. But more than the physical search, Martin was beginning to understand that his mission had evolved beyond historical curiosity. He was carrying the hopes of two families, the dreams of two generations, and the weight of a love story that deserved an ending. Somewhere in the Oregon woods, Jimmy Morrison's bones lay waiting for discovery. Somewhere near Catherine's childhood home, an engagement ring waited to fulfill its purpose, and somewhere in his own heart, Martin was beginning to recognize that completing their story might finally teach him how to honor Eleanor's memory, while choosing to live again rather than simply exist in the shadow of what he had lost. Martin returned from Sacramento with Jimmy's diary burning like a torch in his consciousness, the image of a hidden engagement ring transforming his understanding of the entire story. But it was Eleanor's garden that provided the key to finding what Jimmy Morrison had hidden 80 years ago. While examining his wife's old gardening journals for any mention of the creek behind Catherine's childhood home, Martin discovered something that made his hands shake with recognition. Eleanor had been a meticulous documentarian of their hiking adventures, sketching maps and noting landmarks with the precision of a cartographer. And there, in a journal from their early married years, was a detailed drawing of an enormous oak tree beside a creek near what she had labeled the old Wheeler place. Ancient oak, easily 200+ years old, Eleanor had written in her careful handwriting. Initials carved all over the trunk, some dating back decades. Popular spot for young couples. "M carved our initials here on our 5th anniversary. Such a romantic setting." Martin stared at the page, realizing that he and Eleanor had unknowingly visited Jimmy and Catherine's special place, had added their own initials to a tree that already held the secret of another couple's love story. The coincidence felt too profound to be accidental, as if the universe had been preparing him for this moment across decades of seemingly unrelated experiences. The next morning, Martin set out for the Wheeler property with Rebecca, who had driven down from Seattle to join the search. The oak tree was exactly where Eleanor's sketch indicated, though it had grown significantly in the intervening years. Its massive trunk was indeed carved with initials spanning generations, some fresh, others weathered nearly smooth by time. And weather, there, Rebecca said, pointing to letters carved about 6 feet up the trunk. A JM plus CW, 1943. The initials were faint, but still visible, carved with the careful precision of someone who wanted them to last forever. Below them, the bark showed signs of old tool marks, where someone had worked to create a small hollow in the tree's natural curves. Martin examined the hiding place with the methodical care of an archaeologist. The hollow had been sealed with what appeared to be tree sap and cloth, creating a waterproof cache that had remained hidden for 8 decades. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather that had somehow survived the years, was a small velvet jewelry box. Rebecca gasped as Martin carefully extracted the box, her eyes filling with tears as she realized they had found Jimmy Morrison's engagement ring, the proposal that Catherine had waited 4 years to receive, the future that had died in the Oregon woods just 20 miles away. The ring was simple but beautiful, a small diamond set in a white gold band that had been lovingly polished before its long wait began. Inside the band, an inscription read, "Forever, Jimmy 1943, but it was the note wrapped around the box that transformed the discovery from touching to heartbreaking, written in Jimmy's careful handwriting on paper that had somehow survived its long hiding. The note contained the proposal he had planned to make in person. "My dearest Cat, if you're reading this, then I've kept my promise to come home to you, and you've said yes to becoming my wife. I hid this ring in our special place because I wanted it to wait for us here, where we first kissed, where we first talked about our future together. Every time you walked past this tree during my deployment, our future was waiting right here, just like I was waiting for you. I love you more than words can express, and I promise to spend every day of our marriage proving that love to you. Will you marry me, Catherine Wheeler? Will you help me build the life we've dreamed about in this beautiful place? All my love, forever and always, Jimmy." Martin read the note aloud, while Rebecca sobbed quietly beside him, both of them understanding that they held in their hands one of the most perfectly preserved love letters ever written, a proposal that had waited 80 years for delivery, intended for a woman who had died still wondering what had become of her first love. But it was Rebecca who made the connection that would change everything about Martin's mission. "The date," she whispered, pointing to the corner of Jimmy's note. "Look at the date he wrote this." Martin examined the faded ink more carefully. The note was dated October 14th, 1943, the day before Jimmy's final, fatal mission. He had written his proposal and hidden the ring just hours before climbing into the cockpit for the last time, so certain of his survival and their future that he had already planned the perfect romantic gesture. He was coming home the next day. Rebecca continued, her voice breaking. If the weather had been better, if the mission had been delayed even 24 hours, he would have made it back to propose. They would have been married, had children, grown old together. The cruel precision of the timing hit Martin like a physical blow. Jimmy Morrison had been one day away from happiness, one mission away from the future he had carefully planned and hidden in an oak tree. Catherine had spent October 15th, 1943, waiting for a proposal that was already prepared and ready, while the man who wanted to give it to her was dying alone in the Oregon woods. But as Martin carefully rewrapped the ring and note, Rebecca said something that made him reconsider everything he thought he understood about their story. "Grandmother kept a diary too," she said quietly. "I found it after she died, hidden in her bedroom closet. The entries from October 1943 are, well, they're strange. She wrote about dreams, about feeling Jimmy's presence, about being certain he was trying to tell her something important. Rebecca pulled out her phone and scrolled through photographs she had taken of Catherine's diary pages. Listen to this. It's from October 16th, 1943, the day after Jimmy's plane went missing. I dreamed about our oak tree last night. Jimmy was there, trying to show me something hidden in the bark. He kept pointing and smiling as if he had left me a surprise. When I woke up, I had the strongest urge to walk past the tree on my way to work, but I was running late and didn't. Stop. I keep thinking about that dream. It felt more real than real. Martin stared at the phone screen, feeling the hair on his arms rise with recognition. Catherine had somehow sensed the ring's presence, had been drawn to the exact location where Jimmy's proposal waited, but had never followed her instincts far enough to discover what her heart had been trying to tell her. She wrote about similar dreams for months, Rebecca continued. Always about the oak tree, always about Jimmy trying to show her something, but she never actually searched the tree. I think she was afraid of what she might find, or afraid of what she wouldn't find. The revelation transformed Martin's understanding of the entire story. Catherine hadn't just waited 4 years for Jimmy's return. She had spent decades carrying the unconscious knowledge that he had left her something important, something that would have changed the course of her life if she had been brave enough to look for it. She settled for a life with Robert because she never knew Jimmy had already chosen her completely, Martin said, the full tragedy of their story finally becoming clear. She married him thinking Jimmy's love had been unfinished, incomplete, when in reality he had already committed his entire future to her. Rebecca nodded through her tears. And Robert, my grandfather, he spent his whole marriage knowing he was competing with a ghost, never realizing that the ghost had already made Catherine his bride in every way that mattered. As they walked back toward their cars, Martin carrying Jimmy's proposal in his jacket pocket, he realized that the story had become even more complex and heartbreaking than he had initially understood. 3 people had suffered for 80 years because of one day's difference in timing, because fate had intervened just hours before love could triumph over war and separation. But now Martin held the power to complete what Jimmy Morrison had started, to deliver a proposal that had waited 8 decades for its intended recipient. The question was no longer whether he could find Catherine. She was long dead. The question was whether delivering Jimmy's ring to her memory, to her family, to the world that had forgotten their story, might somehow heal the wounds that time and circumstance had left unresolved. More importantly, Martin was beginning to understand that completing Jimmy and Catherine's love story might finally teach him how to honor Eleanor's memory while choosing to live again, rather than spending the rest of his life waiting for a reunion that could only come in death. The discovery of Jimmy's engagement ring changed everything about Martin's mission, transforming it from historical research into something approaching sacred duty. That evening, sitting in his dining room with Jimmy's proposal note spread before him alongside Catherine's diary and Eleanor's garden journal, Martin felt the weight of 3 interconnected love stories pressing against his chest like a physical presence. Rebecca had returned to Seattle with promises to coordinate with Patricia Morrison Hayes about planning a memorial service that would finally unite Jimmy and Catherine's stories. But she had left Martin with Catherine's complete diary, including entries that revealed the depth of her lifelong connection to the man who had died just 1 day before proposing to her. November 1943. Jimmy should have been home by now, Catherine had written. The army says his plane is missing, but I feel him everywhere, in the woods where we walked, in the oak tree where we carved our initials, in every sunrise that reminds me of the morning he told me he loved me. I know this sounds foolish, but sometimes I dream he's trying to tell me something, trying to show me where he is. Mother says I should prepare for the worst, but my heart refuses to accept that our story is over. Martin read entry after entry, documenting Catherine's intuitive connection to Jimmy's fate, her dreams about the oak tree, her inexplicable certainty that he had left her something important. The tragedy was that her instincts had been perfect. Jimmy had indeed been trying to tell her something, had left her the most important message of their relationship hidden exactly where her dreams kept drawing her attention. But it was Eleanor's garden journal that provided the final piece of the puzzle Martin needed to plan the memorial service properly. His wife had been fascinated by the local history of their hiking area, documenting not just plants and wildlife, but also the human stories connected to various locations. Her entry about the Wheeler property included a detail that made Martin's heart race with possibility. Old Wheeler Homestead includes family cemetery on hill, overlooking the creek, Eleanor had written. Several graves from 1800s and early 1900s, beautifully maintained despite family moving away. Seems like peaceful, place where love stories are remembered even after people are gone. Martin realized that Catherine's family cemetery would be the perfect location for the memorial service, a place where her ancestors rested, where her own ashes could be brought to rest beside the proposal she had never received, where Jimmy Morrison's story could finally be told alongside hers. The next morning brought an unexpected phone call that would change the scope of Martin's memorial plans entirely. His daughter Sarah called from Seattle, her voice carrying a warmth he hadn't heard in years. "Dad, I've been thinking about our conversation last week," she said, "about Mum's journal entries, about how she wanted us to reconnect. I know I've been distant since the funeral, and I'm sorry. Losing Mum was devastating, but watching you disappear into your grief has been almost as hard." Martin felt his throat tighten with emotion he had been suppressing for 2 years. "Sarah, Let me finish, please," she interrupted gently. "I want to come home for a visit, not just a quick weekend, but a real visit where we can talk about Mum, about us, about how to be a family again even though she's gone. Would that be okay?" The timing felt like another piece of destiny clicking into place. Martin found himself telling Sarah about his discovery of the crashed plane, about Jimmy and Catherine's love story, about the memorial service he was planning to complete their interrupted romance. As he spoke, he could hear his daughter's voice, changing, becoming more animated and engaged than it had been since Eleanor's funeral. "Dad, this is incredible," Sarah said. "It's exactly the kind of story Mom would have loved. Remember how she used to say that love stories never really end, they just get passed down through generations? Maybe that's what's happening here. Maybe she led you to that plane so you could finish what Jimmy and Catherine started. They made plans for Sarah to fly in the following weekend, timing her visit to coincide with the memorial service Martin was organizing with Rebecca and Patricia. For the first time in 2 years, Martin felt genuine excitement about the future, about having his daughter home, about the possibility of healing their relationship while honoring the memory of all the love that had shaped their lives. The week passed in a blur of activity as Martin coordinated details for the memorial service. Rebecca drove down from Seattle with Catherine's ashes, which had been stored in a family mausoleum for 25 years, while various relatives debated what to do with them. Patricia arrived from California with Jimmy's military decorations and family photographs, along with her adult children who wanted to witness the completion of their great-uncle's love story. But it was Mrs. Henderson from the Millbrook Library who provided the most significant contribution to the memorial plans. When Martin contacted her about researching the Wheeler family cemetery, she revealed that she had been quietly maintaining the gravesite for decades, inspired by stories her mother had told about Catherine's lifelong devotion to her lost love. "I always felt someone should remember her story," Mrs. Henderson explained as she led Martin up the hill behind the old Wheeler property. "A woman who loved that deeply, who waited that long. Her story deserved to be preserved, even if no one knew all the details." The cemetery was exactly as Eleanor had described it, a peaceful hilltop overlooking the creek where Jimmy and Catherine had shared their first kiss, where an oak tree still held the initials they had carved in 1943. Mrs. Henderson had installed a small bench beside Catherine's parents' graves, creating a meditation space that seemed designed for exactly the kind of ceremony Martin was planning. "There's something else," Mrs. Henderson said, producing a manila envelope she had been carrying. "When Catherine died, her husband Robert brought me this. He said she had specifically requested that if anyone ever came looking for Jimmy Morrison's story, I should give them these." The envelope contained photographs Martin had never seen, pictures of Catherine and Jimmy together during his brief leaves, images that captured the radiant happiness of young love, unaware of its approaching tragedy. In one photo, taken in front of the very oak tree where they had hidden the engagement ring, Catherine's expression was luminous with joy as Jimmy whispered something in her ear. But the final item in the envelope made Martin's hands shake with recognition. It was a letter addressed to James Morrison or his family, written in Catherine's handwriting, just weeks before her death in 1998. "If someone is reading this, then perhaps our story has finally been discovered," the letter began. "I've spent 55 years wondering what happened to Jimmy, 55 years feeling his presence in the woods we loved, 55 years believing he was trying to tell me something I was too afraid or too stubborn to understand. I married a good man and built a meaningful life, but part of my heart never left October 1943, never stopped waiting for Jimmy to come home and explain why he had to leave." The letter continued with Catherine's account of her dreams about the oak tree, her certainty that Jimmy had hidden something there, her regret that she had never been brave enough to search for what her heart kept telling her was waiting. Most heartbreakingly, she had written about her hope that someday, somehow, their story would find its proper ending. "If Jimmy's family ever reads this, please know that he was loved completely and never forgotten," Catherine had written. "If someone finds evidence of what happened to him, please know that his memory brought meaning to every day of my life, even when I couldn't be with him. And if there is any justice in the universe, perhaps love like ours survives death and finds a way to complete itself in whatever comes after." As Martin prepared for bed the night before Sarah's arrival and the memorial service, he found himself thinking about the mysterious ways love persists across time and death and separation. Jimmy Morrison had tried to propose to Catherine Wheeler in 1943, but circumstances had prevented their happiness. 55 years later, Catherine had written a letter to Jimmy's family, still hoping their story might find resolution. And now, 25 years after that, Martin Grady, a man struggling with his own grief and disconnection, had been chosen to deliver the proposal that had waited 80 years for its intended recipient. Tomorrow, in a hilltop cemetery overlooking the creek where two young people had once promised to love each other forever, Martin would finally complete what Jimmy Morrison had started. He would deliver the engagement ring that had waited 8 decades in an oak tree, read the proposal that had been written the night before tragedy struck, and unite two souls who had been separated by war but never truly divided by death. More importantly, Martin was beginning to understand that honoring Jimmy and Catherine's love story might finally teach him how to honor Eleanor's memory while choosing to live again, how to carry the past with gratitude while embracing whatever future remained to be written. Sarah would be there to witness the ceremony, to help him bridge the gap between grief and healing, to begin rebuilding the family connections that Eleanor had died, hoping to see restored. In completing Jimmy and Catherine's story, Martin might finally find the courage to continue writing his own. Sarah arrived on Friday evening carrying flowers from Eleanor's favorite Seattle florist and a nervous energy that reminded Martin of her childhood excitement before important events. She had inherited her mother's expressive eyes and her father's stubborn determination. But tonight, she seemed younger somehow, more vulnerable than the successful environmental lawyer she had become. "I kept thinking about Mom on the flight," she said as Martin helped her with her bags, about how she always believed that everything happened for a reason, that love stories never really ended. Finding this plane, uncovering Jimmy and Catherine's story, it feels like something she would have orchestrated from wherever she is now. They spent the evening going through all the artifacts Martin had collected over the past month. Jimmy's letters, Catherine's diary, the engagement ring that had waited 80 years for delivery, photographs of young lovers who had been separated by war and circumstance. Sarah handled each item with the reverence of someone who understood that she was touching pieces of a love story that transcended death. "They look so happy," she said, studying the photograph of Jimmy and Catherine beside their oak tree. "So certain that their future was guaranteed. It breaks my heart that they never got to grow old together." Martin found himself thinking about his own wedding photos, images of him and Eleanor radiating the same confident joy, the same unshakable belief that love could overcome any obstacle. They had been fortunate enough to have 35 years together, to build a life and watch it evolve through all the seasons of marriage. Jimmy and Catherine had been robbed of that privilege, left with only letters and dreams and a proposal that had never been delivered. Saturday morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of October day that made the Oregon woods seem to glow with inner light. Martin and Sarah drove to the Wheeler family cemetery together, arriving to find Rebecca, Patricia, and her family already gathering on the hilltop overlooking the creek. Mrs. Henderson had brought folding chairs and a small table for displaying Jimmy's military honors and Catherine's photographs. The cemetery felt sacred in the morning light, with ancient headstones marking the graves of Catherine's ancestors and the bench Mrs. Henderson had installed, offering a perfect view of the oak tree where love had once been carved into bark and hidden in hollow spaces. The creek below ran full with autumn rains, its gentle sound providing natural music for the ceremony Martin had planned. "Before we begin," Martin said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air, "I want to thank everyone for being here to witness something that should have happened 80 years ago. We're not just honoring the memory of two people who loved each other, we're completing a promise that war and circumstance prevented from being fulfilled." He began by telling Jimmy Morrison's story, reading excerpts from the young pilot's diary that revealed his growing love for Catherine and his plans for their future together. Patricia contributed memories passed down through her family, stories of a young man who had volunteered for dangerous missions because he believed each one brought him closer to the life he wanted to build in Oregon. Rebecca shared Catherine's side of the story, reading from diary entries that documented her years of waiting, her dreams about the oak tree, her lifelong certainty that Jimmy had been trying to tell her something important. The assembled group listened in respectful silence as the full tragedy of their missed connection became clear. Two people who had loved each other completely, separated by a single day's difference in timing. But it was Sarah who provided the most moving contribution to the ceremony. She had asked to read Eleanor's journal entry about the oak tree, the passage that had helped Martin locate Jimmy's hidden proposal. "My mother wrote this about Jimmy and Catherine's special place, though she didn't know their story when she visited it," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "She wrote about love being carved into bark and time, about how some places hold the memory of promises even after the people who made them are gone. I think she would have loved knowing that her notes helped complete their story." Martin felt his throat tighten as he listened to his daughter honor Eleanor's memory while celebrating the love story that had brought them together again. For the first time since the funeral, talking about Eleanor felt like celebration rather than loss, like gratitude rather than grief. The morning sun climbed higher as Martin prepared to deliver the moment they had all come to witness. The proposal that Jimmy Morrison had written the night before his final mission, intended for a woman who had waited 4 years for words that were hidden just steps from her daily path. Martin removed the engagement ring from its 80-year resting place and held it up to catch the light. its small diamond sparkling with the same brilliance that had captured Jimmy's attention in a California jewelry store in 1943. Around him, the assembled families fell silent, understanding that they were about to witness something unprecedented, a proposal delivered across 8 decades of separation, a love story finally finding its proper conclusion. Martin unfolded Jimmy Morrison's proposal note with hands that trembled slightly, the paper crackling softly in the morning stillness. Around him, the small gathering of family members leaned forward, understanding that they were about to hear words that had waited 80 years to reach their intended audience. These are the words Jimmy Morrison wrote for Catherine Wheeler on October 14, 1943, Martin said, his voice carrying the weight of decades. The proposal he planned to deliver the next day before his final mission took him from her forever. He cleared his throat and began to read. My dearest Cat, if you're reading this, then I've kept my promise to come home to you, and you've said yes to becoming my wife. I hid this ring in our special place because I wanted it to wait for us here, where we first kissed, where we first talked about our future together. Rebecca wiped tears from her eyes as she listened to words her grandmother had yearned to hear. For 4 years of waiting, words that would have changed the entire course of Catherine's life if fate had allowed Jimmy to deliver them in person. Martin continued reading, his teacher's voice giving weight and dignity to Jimmy's passionate declaration. Every time you walked past this tree during my deployment, our future was waiting right here, just like I was waiting for you. I love you more than words can express, and I promise to spend every day of our marriage proving that love to you. Patricia Morrison Hayes sobbed quietly as she heard her great-uncle's voice speaking across the decades, finally able to complete the proposal that had been interrupted by tragedy. Her children stood with arms around each other, moved by the realization that love could transcend death and time and circumstances beyond human control. Will you marry me, Catherine Wheeler? Martin read, his voice breaking slightly on the question that had waited 8 decades for an answer. Will you help me build the life we've dreamed about in this beautiful place? All my love, forever and always, Jimmy. The silence that followed was profound, filled with the weight of answered prayers and completed promises. Even the creek below seemed to pause in its flowing, as if nature itself recognized the significance of this moment. Sarah stepped forward and placed her hand on Martin's shoulder, offering the strength that Eleanor would have provided if she had been there to witness this completion of interrupted love. On behalf of Catherine Wheeler, she said softly, and speaking for all the women who have loved completely and waited faithfully, yes, Jimmy Morrison. Yes, she would have married you. Yes, she would have built that beautiful life with you. Martin slipped the engagement ring onto Catherine's urn, completing the proposal that had been prevented by war and hidden by time. The small diamond caught the morning light exactly as it had been meant to 80 years earlier, when a young pilot had saved every penny to buy a symbol of forever for the woman who owned his heart. I think they're together now, Rebecca whispered, looking toward the oak tree where carved initials still marked the place where love had been promised and hope had been hidden. I think they finally get to have that conversation, to plan that future, to be happy the way they always should have been. But it was what happened next that transformed the ceremony from historical commemoration into personal healing. Martin reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew Eleanor's wedding ring, the simple gold band he'd been carrying like a talisman since her death 2 years earlier. Eleanor always believed that love stories never really end, he said, his voice steady but emotional. She believed they get passed down through generations, that they teach us how to love better, how to appreciate what we have while we have it. He turned to Sarah, holding out the ring that had symbolized his marriage for 35 years. I think it's time for this to continue its story, not because I'm letting go of your mother's memory, but because she would want love to keep, flowing forward instead of being trapped in the past. Sarah's hands shook as she accepted her mother's ring, understanding that her father was offering her not just a piece of jewelry, but a legacy of love, a promise that their family's story would continue, even though Eleanor was no longer there. To write it with them. Mom would have loved this moment, Sarah said through tears. She would have loved seeing Jimmy and Catherine's story completed, seeing our family healing, seeing you choose to honor her memory by living again instead of just surviving. As the sun reached its zenith above the cemetery, Martin felt something shift inside his chest, not the lifting of grief, but its transformation from burden into blessing. He would always miss Eleanor, would always carry the ache of her absence, but he no longer needed to live as if his story had ended with hers. Around him, 3 generations of 2 families stood together, united by love that had transcended death and time and the cruel accidents of history. Jimmy Morrison and Catherine Wheeler were finally engaged, their promise delivered and accepted across 8 decades of separation. And Martin Grady was finally ready to honor his wife's memory by choosing to live fully in whatever time remained to him, surrounded by family love that would continue long after he joined Eleanor in whatever came next. 3 months later, Martin stood in the same kitchen where his grief had once felt insurmountable, but the morning routine that had sustained him through 2 years of solitude had transformed into something approaching joy. He still filled Eleanor's painted mug with coffee and stood at the window overlooking her garden. But now he could smile at the roses she had planted, could appreciate their wild beauty without feeling that pruning them would somehow diminish her memory. The biggest change was the sound of voices in the house. Sarah had taken a leave of absence from her Seattle law firm to spend the holidays in Oregon, ostensibly to help her father sort through family belongings, but really to rebuild the relationship that grief and stubbornness had nearly destroyed. Her laughter echoed through rooms that had been silent too long, and her presence filled spaces that Martin hadn't realized had been holding their breath for 2 years. "Dad, you have to see this," Sarah called from the living room, where she was working on a project that would have made Eleanor proud. She had been collaborating with Rebecca and Patricia to create a memorial website documenting Jimmy and Catherine's complete love story, using the letters, photographs, and diary entries they had discovered to preserve their romance for future generations. The website had attracted attention from historians, genealogy enthusiasts, and people who were simply moved by the story of love transcending death and time. Veterans organizations had reached out about using Jimmy's story in their educational programs, and the local historical society had expressed interest in creating a permanent memorial at the crash site. But the most meaningful response had come from other families dealing with similar losses. People who had lost loved ones in wars, accidents, and sudden illnesses wrote to express how Jimmy and Catherine's story had helped them process their own grief and find ways to honor memory while choosing to continue living. Martin had started volunteering at the Regional Veterans Center, sharing Jimmy Morrison's story with aging servicemen who understood the particular weight of promises interrupted by duty and circumstances beyond personal control. His teaching skills had found new purpose in helping other people connect their family histories to larger historical narratives, showing them how individual love stories formed the human fabric of major events. The work felt like a natural extension of what he had been doing in the classroom for 35 years, but with a deeper emotional resonance that came from personal experience with loss and recovery. Eleanor would have appreciated the irony that his retirement had led him to more meaningful work than he had ever done while drawing a salary. "Mrs. Chen called," Sarah announced, looking up from her laptop with a mischievous smile that reminded Martin of Eleanor at her most scheming. "She wants to know if you're planning to attend the New Year's Eve potluck at the community center. Apparently, there's a widow from Portland who recently moved to the area and could use some friendly faces." Martin felt a familiar flutter of anxiety at the suggestion of social interaction, but it was tempered now by curiosity, rather than overwhelmed by grief. The idea of meeting new people, of potentially developing friendships or even something deeper, no longer felt like betrayal of Eleanor's memory. Instead, it felt like honoring her belief that life was meant to be shared, that love multiplied, rather than diminished when it was given away. "I might consider it," he said carefully, earning a delighted grin from his daughter. The truth was that Martin had been thinking about the future more concretely in recent weeks. Not planning anything dramatic, but allowing himself to imagine possibilities beyond the careful routines of grief and remembrance. He had even started making small changes to the house, not erasing Eleanor's presence, but making space for new experiences alongside the preserved memories. Eleanor's coffee cup still sat in the dish drainer, but Martin had started using it, occasionally for his own morning coffee, carrying her with him into each new day, rather than keeping her frozen in place. Her garden tools had been cleaned and organized, ready for spring planting that would honor her love of growing things, while allowing for new varieties and arrangements. The phone rang regularly now. Calls from Sarah, from Rebecca checking on. His progress with additional research, from Patricia sharing family updates, and from new acquaintances at the Veterans Center who had become genuine friends. The isolation that had felt necessary during the acute phase of grief had given way to connections that felt life-giving rather than draining. Martin had also started hiking with purpose beyond exercise and remembrance. He was documenting the trail system he and Eleanor had developed, creating maps and guides that would help other people discover the beauty of the Oregon woods, where so much love and loss and healing had taken place. The crash site had been properly marked with a memorial plaque honoring Jimmy Morrison's service and sacrifice, creating a destination for people who wanted to pay their respects to a love story that had inspired so many. As afternoon light slanted through the kitchen windows, Martin opened the new hiking journal that had replaced his old routine of walking in silence. These pages documented not just trails and weather conditions, but observations about life renewal, gratitude for family reconciliation, and hope for whatever chapters remained to be written. "I think Jimmy and Catherine would approve," he wrote. In his latest entry, "Their story taught me that love doesn't end with death. It changes form, finds new expressions, gets passed down through the people who are touched by it. Eleanor's love lives on, in Sarah's laughter, in the connections we're rebuilding, in my willingness to remain open to whatever comes next." The sun was setting over the Oregon hills as Martin closed his journal and began preparing dinner for two, a routine that felt miraculous after 2 years of solitary meals. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, new opportunities to honor the past while embracing the future, new chances to live fully in appreciation for love that transcends death and time and all the accidents of human circumstance. Outside, the Douglas firs swayed in an evening breeze that carried the promise of spring, and somewhere in the distance, an oak tree continued to shelter the carved initials of couples who had learned that love stories never really end. They just find new ways to continue.